All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Christina Lee, and I'm the fellow at the University of Georgia's First Amendment Clinic. And presenting with me today is my colleague Ward, who's the staff attorney with us. And we're going to start today discussing safe and legally sound scoops. And we're going to start by talking about safety tips for journalists reporting at the scene of potentially contentious events. And then I'll turn it over to Ward to talk about other legal considerations for journalists. So thanks for joining, and please feel free to leave questions as you have them in the chat, but we're going to wait until the end to start to address them after we finish the whole presentation. So to get started, I'm going to set the scene a bit with talking about some statistics that journalists have faced in the 2024 election. And we're going to talk a little bit more about just generally the political violence that's been occurring and how that impacts journalism. So to briefly turn to these statistics, while working as political journalists in 2024 during the election, 37.7% of journalists reported being threatened with or experiencing physical violence. 30.66% of journalists reported being threatened with or experiencing digital violence, and 26.93% of journalists reported legal threats or action against them. So those are some pretty high numbers to just keep in mind. And then sort of turning to more recent events, it's important to acknowledge that we're in an increasingly tense political climate. And this is particularly demonstrated recently as political figures on both sides of the aisle have been targeted. So first, in June of this year, 2 Minnesota lawmakers were assassinated in their home, and Melissa Hortman, who was one of the victims, was the Minnesota State House's top Democrat. And as we probably can all recall, this past month, the right-wing podcaster Charlie Kirk was shot at an on-campus event in Utah, and the murder suspect allegedly used bullets with far-right slogans on them. And of course, we all remember that during the election last year, there was an attempted assassination of Donald Trump. So these three incidents are, of course, just examples, and they show a concerning upward trend of political violence all over the country. And this is important context for journalists when they're considering safety on assignment. So to start us off, we're going to kind of take the reporting progress in three discrete pieces. So first, we'll talk about preliminary risk assessment. Then we'll talk about things to do when you're on the scene. And then we will talk about any post-event strategies and things to do. So we want to give you some practical tips so you can provide necessary coverage and keep yourself physically, mentally, and digitally safe. So we're going to talk first about things you should consider before you enter the scene. So the first question you should ask yourself before you go out to cover a story is what kind of risks you can encounter. And it's important to examine this from all different angles. So first, ask who's going to be there. Will there be a big crowd, and are they likely to be agitated from the subject matter? Ask how crowded a space might be, and you should also consider if there's an increased risk of mob behavior or trampling. You should also consider whether or not law enforcement will be present, and whether there's a risk that they will use tear gas, rubber bullets, or other forms of crowd control to make arrests. You should also consider if the event is likely to be a target of gun violence. And this should be intuitive, but there's a higher chance of gun violence when an event is particularly divisive, like at a political event or a political rally. This is not meant to be fear-mongering or encouraging you to only think of the worst-case scenario, but it is important to be prepared and think through the possibilities ahead of time. Next, you should consider who should go. It's great to establish a team of people before you head out. And ideally, you shouldn't be by yourself on an assignment. You want colleagues around you to make the job more efficient and to have people watching your back in case things get tense. When you're getting your team together, you want to consider the practical skills of everyone on the team and the team's overall chemistry. You should include at least one person who has experience covering the type of event that you're covering. And you also want to make sure people are comfortable with each other because that will make communication easier when things are critical. In case the team does get separated from each other, we recommend establishing a communication or check-in procedure. An easy way to do this is just to create a group message and give people periodic status updates over text. It's also a good idea to have emergency contact numbers written on a piece of paper or on your body somewhere in case you get separated from your phone or your phone battery dies. Emergency contacts include people like a lawyer or a legal hotline, your editor if you have one, or a friend or trusted family member. If you are flying solo, most of this advice still applies. So you should let your family and your colleagues know where you're going and check in with them periodically and keep emergency contacts on your person. However, we definitely still encourage you to bring people with you if possible, even if it's just one buddy. And it could be a friend who's not a journalist. If you're on the scene and you are planning to go alone, it's also a good idea to speak with other journalists on the scene, even if they're not covering with the same outlet you're covering with. You just want to have someone around to watch your back while you're focused on getting the story. Another thing to ask yourself is, how familiar are you with the location? In the same way you want to be comfortable with your team members, it's important to be comfortable with the place you're working at as well. So that will help you be focused on your assignment while you're on the scene. You don't want to be having to look at Google Maps and trying to figure out where you are or how to get somewhere as you are trying to do your job. So the best way to get familiar with the location is to go there prior to the event, just to scope it out. And depending on the event you're covering, you might not need to do this. So if it's in a part of town where you've been before and you're familiar with it, you might not have to do that. But if it's somewhere you've never been, you should probably plan to visit ahead of time. If you can't do that, the second best way to feel comfortable with a location is to bring someone who already is familiar with the location with you. And if those aren't options, at the very least, you should look at a map online and see if there's any reviews or discussion online of that location. And that should give you an idea of the space from kind of a bird's eye view. And it'll allow you to not be completely disoriented when you get to the scene. You'll want to map out checkpoints for you and your buddy, find the best vantage points you can, and locate at least 2 exit routes in advance of going to the scene. And when you arrive on the day of the event, you should make sure that you can find all of these locations and routes that you've planned. So there are a few other elements to consider. First, whether it will be dark outside or what time of day it will be. If it is dark outside, that does increase risks because it limits visibility. So you should be sure to have either a physical flashlight on you or be prepared to use your phone as a flashlight. But beware, of course, that you can get separated from your phone or your phone could die. So it's best practice, if you can, to either have a separate physical flashlight, or if you're definitely going to rely on your phone, to have an extra backup battery with you. The next tip might seem to be the most obvious of these things, but be sure to check the weather forecast in advance. So it's good to make sure you won't be uncomfortably hot or cold based on your clothing choices. And also keep in mind that, like in the dark, visibility can be decreased by fog or rain. So make sure if that's in the forecast, you'll want to have access to a light source. You should also think ahead about protecting anything that might need protecting from the elements. So if you're worried about rain, make sure you're bringing a waterproof camera bag or bringing extra raincoats or ponchos to cover your equipment. The last thing to consider before you go to an event is what to wear. The most important thing to remember here is that you want to be able to move around easily and safely. So wear closed-toed shoes instead of sandals, and tend toward pants instead of skirts or dresses. You don't want your clothes to be too loose so that they can be grabbed or caught on things. And you want to make sure your fabric choices are non-flammable. So try to avoid cotton and linen. Also, it's best to not wear anything particularly expensive or flashy that could attract any unwanted attention. Along those same lines, it's good to leave sentimental things at home because you don't want to end up in a situation where you've dropped something very meaningful or you've lost it and you can't find it anymore. You should also take a minute before you go to research the event and see if there's anything posted online or on flyers advertising the event describing what participants are wearing. If possible, it's good to avoid blending in too much with the people participating in the event, particularly if it's a protest. For example, if the participants are wearing all black, you should choose to wear another color. Actually, wearing all black has become associated with the Antifa lately, and because Antifa is now deemed a terrorist organization, being associated with that group could be really problematic for you. In general, we advise wearing neutral colors where you can, because this won't draw too much attention to anyone's eye and will likely not be part of a quote unquote uniform or any planned outfits that protesters are wearing. Another big tip is to be prepared if the police do start using tear gas or pepper spray. And this is a bit of a balancing act because you want to be prepared if tear gas or pepper spray can be deployed, and that can happen really quickly. However, you might not want to be wearing PPE and drawing a lot of attention to yourself by being the only person there wearing a mask or a ventilator or something. So we recommend that you have a grab bag to have easy access to your PPE and things so you can reach it if you really start to need it quickly. You might also have heard that it's a good idea to keep a small container of milk with you to rinse out your eyes, but recent advice from the CDC recommends that you just use water because milk can cause bacterial infections if it gets too warm, and it's just kind of a hassle. So we recommend bringing water for rinsing out your eyes if you need, and also carrying water on you for drinking and staying hydrated at the event. The other note about being prepared for tear gas is to wear glasses instead of contacts if you do need them to see. Unfortunately, tear gas can cause contact lenses to fuse to a person's eyeballs, and that is really painful and uncomfortable. So, of course, you reduce your risk of that by wearing glasses instead of contacts. The last thing to consider when deciding what you'll wear is whether or not you want to wear your media affiliation's logo. If your outlet is known for particularly partisan coverage, you might want to think again before wearing your logo so you don't face confrontation because of how people might view the outlet itself. It might be a good idea to wear a generic press vest to alert police that you are a journalist, although generally you might want to consider that saying that your press might bring some risk from anti-press protesters in general. At the end of the day, how you want to identify yourself visually is a personal choice that you should make based on your own assessment of the risks in a situation. And regardless of what you choose to wear, do remember it's a good idea to have physical credentials or business cards available to present them to anyone who asks, particularly the police, so you will always be able to identify yourself quickly as a journalist. So that covers what you should do to prepare. Now we're going to transition to talking about what you should do when you get to a scene. So the first thing to know is that we advise you to get to a scene early so that you can confirm key locations that we have discussed earlier, namely check-in spots, vantage points, and exit routes. And this next set of tips is going to be things to keep in mind once you're physically there. So the first thing, like we mentioned earlier, is to use a buddy system if possible. It's ideal to have somebody else physically there to know where you are and what you're doing at all times, and vice versa. That way you can take care of each other and watch each other's backs. Even if you're the sole reporter for your outlet, it would be helpful to have a colleague from another news source to tag team the event with you. Or, like we mentioned earlier, you can bring a non-journalist friend with you to just be there with you on the scene. You should be alert and try to avoid aggressors. Aggressors pose the biggest risk of real violence because they can escalate things very quickly. And to avoid them, you should be on the lookout for people who are clearly under the influence of any kind of substance. You should also be aware that when you approach people, it's best to maintain eye contact, to speak calmly and slowly, and to watch their body language. If they don't seem happy to be speaking with you or are becoming confrontational, it's okay to discontinue speaking with them and just walk away. If you're able to, it might be a good idea to keep your camera on the entire time that you're on the scene. And if you do choose to do that, it's best to not walk around necessarily showing that you're recording everyone or being too obvious about it, because people might react poorly if they feel like they're being filmed without consent. Even if that does mean you can't get a great image when you're filming, it can be helpful to have audio just to have a record of what's going on if something does happen. And of course, you should consider your own resources and decide if that's feasible for you to have the camera on the whole time. For example, if you're using your phone and you're worried about battery drainage, it might not be feasible to have things on the whole time, but in general, it's good to have a recording. When you do want to film with someone who's present at the event, it's a good idea to establish rapport with the interview subject for a little while before you turn the camera on or make them aware that you're recording. If the interaction is going well, you can turn the camera on, and even if it's a little bit frustrating to have to repeat yourself, it's good to reestablish that background as you need. And easing in this way can help people feel more relaxed, and it does decrease the the risk that they will react poorly to being on camera, or that they will be performing for the camera. And our last major tip here is to use your peripheral vision and hearing to remain alert to bystanders and what they're doing. We know this is really difficult when you're trying to do your job and do reporting and pay attention to asking questions and what anyone on the scene is saying. And so that's why, again, we really recommend using the buddy system where possible. If you are alone, try to be mindful of what is going on around you, even if your attention is diverted elsewhere. And we wanted to introduce you to a safety method called the PDM method. This is recommended by safety experts for journalists who are reporting on contentious events. PDM stands for positioning, distance, and movement. For positioning, journalists should be mindful of where they are in a scene. So you should avoid standing in the streets or standing in between police officers if they're there. And if you're alone, again, try not to turn your back onto any threats, and do your best to not get in the middle of crowds, but try to stay sort of removed from things. For distance, it's best practice to be 15 feet away from police officers at all times, or more, but this is especially true when you're filming because you don't want to cause any potential tension with police who might feel like you are interrupting their work or being in their space. And our last portion here is called movement, and that has to deal with keeping yourself going. You don't want to stay in one place for too long. So you should always maintain situational awareness, being aware of what's going on around you, and plan to move in and out from the center of a protest if you do decide to get into the mix. And this movement is called the flower method because it sort of looks like a flower, the petals going in and out. So you'll want to be taking yourself in and then getting out by the same method or by the same direction that you came in. So going in and out and moving around constantly. The police may employ a tactic called kettling, and that's a riot control technique that's used to trap and detain protesters. This often will happen at static protests like the encampments that happened on campuses last year. And movement in and out of the center of a protest is the best way to mitigate the possibility of being caught in a kettling situation. The other method police typically will use to disperse protesters is called divide and conquer, and we'll try to split up a crowd and move them toward an exit, but we'll round up and arrest people who are unable to make it to an exit sufficiently quickly. So in either type of dispersal, you'll want to be able to move out of the way and toward an exit very quickly. And so keeping moving while you're covering a protest will prevent you from getting stuck. Talking more about interacting with the police in general, we will sort of get into more of the specifics here. But the most important thing to do is to stay aware of the police, stay aware of where they are, where their moods and movements lie, and listen out for their orders and instructions. So one thing to do is to keep an eye out for police and how they're positioning themselves. This will usually take two forms at a protest, containment mode versus dispersal mode. So in containment mode, this is where police are trying to keep things from getting out of hand, but aren't really actively engaging. So if they have riot gear on, their visors will be up, their shields will likely be on the ground, and there will be gapping in between officers. This means there's not likely to be any imminent action. But once police enter dispersal mode, this is a shift where police are trying to break up a protest and use tactics like deploying tear gas or pepper spray, flashbang or rubber guns, or other types of dispersal methods. In this mode, police will put up their visors and put their visors down, and put their shields up. And this signals that they're moments away from action. This is a signal that you should try to exit the scene as soon as possible. It's not a bad idea to introduce yourself to police as a journalist right away when you get to the scene if things are calm. It can be helpful for them to know who you are before anything happens. The other two tips about being prepared for an interaction with the police are you should be sure that you have your government ID somewhere easily accessible. It's best to keep both a picture of it on your phone and a hard copy that's separate from your phone in case you lose access to your phone. You should also do the same with your media credentials, so you should have both the hard copy and a picture. And keeping e-business cards on your phone easily available is a great idea because it's a quick way to prove that you're a journalist just by opening your phone. You should also either memorize or write on your arms the number of who you'll call if you do get arrested. We suggest memorizing or writing something on your body rather than keeping it on your phone or on a piece of paper because you might lose access to your phone or lose a slip of paper but hopefully you'll always have your memory and your limbs. If your organization does have a lawyer, you should carry that lawyer's number on you and let that lawyer know ahead of time where you're going. If you have an editor, it's also good to carry their number as well, because they can be particularly effective and persistent advocates with the police, and can help shorten the amount of time you're detained. If neither of those are options, you should carry the number of a legal hotline. So on the slide at the bottom, we have the hotline number for the Reporters Committee of Freedom of the Press, and they help journalists all the time. So that is a good sort of baseline for you to have. Also, if it isn't memorized, we recommend carrying the number of your most reliable friend or family member on you in case you do get detained. It's also important to remember that journalists aren't a specially protected class of individuals, but you do have the same rights as anyone else on the scene. So journalists are required to abide by reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. So time, place, and manner restrictions are rules generally that apply to everyone at a location. An example would be that you have to stay out of the street and on the sidewalk, or that you can't block access to buildings. These restrictions might not be posted anywhere, so you should be sure to listen to the police. You have a right to be present in public spaces, but you can't trespass on private property. When you're in an outdoor public space, like on a street or on the sidewalk, you do have the right to record anything that's in plain view. However, if you are in a public building or you're on private property, there might be rules against recording that you'll have to abide by. If you are on private property, you can get permission to be there and to record from the owner of that property, but police may not respect that. And so just be aware that police may not know or may not respect that. So it's important to just know that you might encounter that in a situation, even if you do have permission. You also should listen when the police tell you to do things. So if they give a dispersal order, you should heed it unless you've spoken to the police and gotten permission to stay. So when the police issue a dispersal order, they should give you notice of the order and a reasonable opportunity to comply. This means that they should give you an exit route to follow before you can be arrested or charged with unlawful assembly, reasonable opportunity to comply, including giving enough time and a clear path, clear and detailed notice, including how much time you have to disperse, and they should tell you the consequences of failing to disperse. If the police aren't giving you this information, it's okay to ask them for it and to record yourself asking them for it. If you have a buddy with you, it's even better to have them record it as well. We might recommend this because if the police aren't properly carrying out their dispersal order, a recording could be evidence of that later on. In a perfect world, the police would know the law and would strictly adhere to it, but unfortunately, that's not quite the world we're in. Ultimately, trust your gut on when it's time to leave, even if the police haven't provided all the information that they are supposed to. And you should talk to your editor in advance to decide whether they expect you to stay or take the risk of being arrested. Police officers may not confiscate or demand to view your photographs, videos, or reporting notes without a warrant. This is generally true even after the police have arrested you and taken your phone. Be aware that if you do consent to show the police anything on your phone, even if it's just one photo, this may constitute consent for them to review all of your photographs and videos. Make it clear that you do not consent if they ask to view your material. And remember that the police may not just delete or destroy data or notes under any circumstances. If you do find yourself in a situation where you've been actually arrested, the most important thing to do is to remain calm. Do not resist arrest because this could result in the police using force against you. And remember that you do have the right to remain silent. Do not volunteer any information. When asked to identify yourself, state that you're a journalist first, and then provide only your name, address, and the name of the company with which you're affiliated. Present the officer with your press credentials if you can, and ask explicitly if you're being detained. Once police have arrested you, they'll likely search you, and they may take custody of your equipment. Remember that they still don't have the right to open your phone. It's a good idea to have a manual passcode on your phone rather than biometrics like Face ID so that the police can't just hold your phone up to your face to open it and unlock it. If the police do insist on looking at what's in your phone, be sure to confirm verbally that they're requiring you to show them things and that you do not consent to a search. Try to record the encounter if you can, or to have a buddy record if possible. Even if you can't get a good image, getting the audio of the interaction can be extremely important. So now you finished your coverage, and we'll discuss some safety tips for digital safety and protecting your mental health after the actual event. The most important thing to know about this section is to physically remove yourself from the situation before you start reflecting on your gathered material. You should remove yourself from the scene and not stay there any longer than you must to get the story that you want. So first, to talk about doxing. As a journalist, you are a public figure, even if you don't necessarily feel like one. And so you should take precautions as if you are one. If you're unfamiliar with the term doxing, it means to search for and publish private or identifying information about a particular individual on the internet, typically with malicious intent. It's essentially an internet-based form of harassment. We've seen situations where people will find someone's home address on the internet, call the cops from an anonymous number, and report that a crime is happening at that address just to get the police to show up to someone's house for no reason. In order to avoid things like this happening to you, you should clean up your online identity. First, you should make sure your personal accounts are private and don't divulge too much information. You should also make sure that your passwords are all different and not super easy to guess. And you should also talk to friends and family members about what they're posting about you. If someone is internet savvy and really has malicious intent to try to find you, they can use your family and friends' accounts to learn more information about you. So make sure you have conversations with your family and friends about how you are being posted about online from other accounts. You should also plan to protect your data. If you want to take extra precautions regarding data protection, there are lots of cybersecurity services that you can use, like Delete Me and Recorded Future, and these can work for both individuals and organizations. Also, if possible, you should try to use your work phone rather than a personal phone when on assignment, because if your phone ends up lost or stolen, you don't want it to be a phone that has your personal information on it. And the last thing to consider, and that we'd advise on, is protecting your mental health. Sometimes when stories are really controversial, journalists can come under attack personally. And you can protect yourself from that by making sure, again, that your personal accounts are private. So don't accept followers on accounts if you don't know them. And it's okay to block people who are harassing you online. If you're feeling uncomfortable or upset by your online engagement, consider taking a break. And you could also find someone that you trust to talk to, whether that's a friend, a family member, a colleague, or a mental health professional. A colleague is a great option here because they likely have real life experience with the unique situation of being a journalist online. You shouldn't be afraid to talk about how you feel. I'm going to pass the baton now to Ward to talk about other legal considerations for journalists.
Thank you, Christina. Christina has spoken about how to, keep safe and how to avoid being injured when covering stories. And that we'll talk now about how to try and avoid being sued as well, which is also I'm sure a goal that all of us have. So we're going to start by talking about defamation, which is one of, if not the most common things that uh, we speak to about journalists. Journalists always have questions about defamation, how to avoid being sued for defamation, what is it, etc. So we're going to open with that, and then we'll talk about copyright and a couple of other, torts or potential claims that may come up when you're going about uh, gathering the news. First, defamation. What is defamation? Great question. It is a published false statement of fact made about an identifiable person where the speaker or publisher acted with the required level of fault, and the false statement caused the person to suffer damage to their reputation. That's a lot. Each of those, each of those phrases that are highlighted in red. We'll talk about each of those in turn and kind of explain what that means. Now, two things. First, defamation can sometimes be called libel or slander based on if the statement is oral or written. But they're both considered, or courts will evaluate whether something is or is not defamation the same, whether or not it's oral or written, slander or libel. So we'll just talk about defamation generally speaking, because the analysis will be the same. And then second, so there are for the definition, there are about five different uh, categories, or things. Again, in the law, we call them elements, that a plaintiff that wants to sue for defamation has to show, or has to prove in court if they want to sue someone successfully. And they have to, to use a baseball metaphor, they have to bat 1,000 on those. They have to show all five of those. If they can't show any one of them, then they can't successfully sue somebody for defamation. So as we're going through each of these elements in turn, just want y'all to kind of have that in the back of your mind and maybe be thinking about which ones might be easier to show and which ones might be more difficult to show. So first, we'll talk about um, what it means for a statement to be published. Now, a statement being published just means that it's communicated to any third person, besides anyone other than the speaker or the person who's being talked about. So if you were speaking to me about me and it's just the two of us, then that can't constitute defamation because there's no third party. But if you're speaking to me about someone else, then that can constitute defamation. It's also important to remember that, especially in the age of social media today, if somebody tweets something and you publish that tweet in an article, or quote tweeted or something, that can constitute defamation in and of itself because you may not have made the initial statement, but by restating that statement, you have published it again, and so that's an additional kind of instance of publication, and so you can be you can be held liable, or you can satisfy this element, I guess, based on that. Now there are for a communication to be published, it must be unprivileged, and that just means there are certain um, narrow exceptions for communications that may otherwise fit the definition of being published, but they don't. But we don't deem them to be defamatory. So a classic example of this is conversations you have with your attorney. So if you're talking to your attorney for the purposes of obtaining legal advice, communications you have with that person, with your attorney, won't be defamatory, even if if the same exact conversation may be defamatory if you were talking to another person in another context. Now, obviously, for journalists, if you're publishing a story, that is going to, you are intentionally communicating to third person. So publication is necessarily going to be satisfied in the journalism context. Next, we have the statement has to be factual. And there are two ways to kind of think about that. The first is that it must be a statement asserting a fact, not asserting an opinion. So only statements of facts can be defamatory. And the way to think about that is, if someone says, "Hey, I think the sky is red," that's that is a statement that's falsifiable. You can go outside and you can check and you can verify whether or not that statement is true or false. And that's different than a statement such as, saying so and so is bad at his job. That's, everyone's that's going to be difficult to falsify. It's going to be hard to prove or disprove that statement, right? Everyone's going to have different opinions on how to evaluate somebody. Everyone's going to use different metrics, and so um it's not really falsifiable, and therefore it's not a statement of fact. It's a mere opinion. So, first it has to be first to be defamation, and it has to be a statement asserting it has to be a statement of fact, which means it has to be falsifiable. And then second, it has to be the statement has to be false. Meaning, and what I mean by that is just truth is a perfect defense to defamation. So if you and that's in the Georgia Constitution. So if what you're saying is true, then you can't be held liable for defamation. Now, what does it mean for something to be true? It just has to be substantially true. Courts aren't going to rip one line of an article out of context. They're going to read the statements in an article, in the context of the article as a whole. And so, as long as facts aren't misstated, distorted, or arranged so as to convey a false and defamatory meaning, um, uh, there's no liability for, somewhat less than complete report of the truth. So a good example of this is, if you say so and so was, convicted of, I don't know, speeding or a DUI on October 16th, and it actually happened on November 16th. Um, if the mistake was made in good faith, the rest of the article is, true and accurate. Uh, you're probably not, getting a date wrong is probably not going to constitute defamation, right? But now let's say that you wrote that someone was convicted of a DUI and they were actually convicted of jaywalking, or they weren't convicted of anything at all. That is probably not going to be substantially true. And so you're probably not going to get the protection of this substantial truth, as it's called, doctrine. So, uh, it's a lot easier. You just want to make sure that what you're writing is true. You have a little bit of coverage. Courts are going to, uh, read what you wrote in good faith, but it's a lot better to just know that what you're writing is true than rely on this substantial truth doctrine. So next, we have that the statement has to be made about an identifiable person. It's important here to remember you don't actually have to use the person's name for them to be identifiable. It just has to be of and concerning them. And the test that courts will use is, they ask whether someone who knows the subject of the statement could reasonably have understood the statement to be about them. So, something that Christina and I have come across sometimes is somewhat, an outlet will write something and they'll refer to so and so who worked at a facility, or they'll say one of the nurses or one of the janitors or who worked at so and so facility. Well, there's only one janitor or one nurse or one person fitting that role, then you don't have to use that person's name for someone who knows that person to read the article and say, oh, well, if they're talking about the janitor, I mean, Steve is the only janitor at that place, so it's got to be about him. So that's something to think about. If you want to avoid this element by anonymizing what you're writing, you need to make sure that you're actually doing that and you're not um, writing in such a way that, while it may not use the person's name, still kind of provides an easy path for people to determine who you're writing about. So next we have the statement has to have been made with the required level of fault. And there are two levels of fault that apply to statements that could constitute defamation. One, for public officials, so like Governor Kemp; for public figures, so people that are famous, like like I don't know, Kim Kardashian, uh, or even limited purpose public figures. And these are persons who may not be famous or not as well known as, Kim Kardashian, but they maybe in a particular industry or in a particular area, they're very well known. And so if you're writing about them, within that industry or within the small town, that they're very well known. And it may be that they are a limited purpose public figure. And so what that means is just for the purposes of the article that you're writing, they may be deemed a public figure. And so for public figures, the standard of fault is actual malice. So for a person to be held liable for defamation, the plaintiff has to show that the speaker, or the person who said the thing or wrote the thing, either knew what they were writing was false or had a reckless disregard for the truth. That's obviously, somewhat difficult to show, or at least more difficult than the other standard of fault, which applies to private figures. So that's, people like you and me, folks who aren't particularly well known, they don't inhabit a public office or anything. For those persons, the plaintiff would only have to show negligence, which just means a lack of reasonable care. Now, what does it mean to have written something with a lack of reasonable care? It's There's no one answer to that question. Unfortunately, I can't tell you, hey, if you do these four things, a court is definitely going to find that you've acted with a reasonable level of care. But um, there are things you can do to make it more likely that a court will find that you've acted with a reasonable level of care. So, courts are going to look at, have you done your research? Have you vetted sources that you've used? Are the sources that you're using credible? Have you given the person who you're, writing against, for lack of a better term, in your story, have you given them an opportunity to provide comments, sharing their side of the story? Those things are all, things that individually may not, 100% guarantee that you are going to be found to have acted with a reasonable level of care. But if you do, all of those, if you're careful and cautious, and you're with your sources, and you vet them, and you do your research, you follow the best practices of, journalistic ethics. If you adhere to the standards of, your editors in your newsrooms, those are all things that are going to make it more likely that a court will find that you have acted with a reasonable level of care, and therefore that you haven't been negligent. So next, we have damaged your reputation. So the statement must have damaged a person's reputation. And there are two types of statements. There's defamation per se, and there's defamation per quad. And because we're attorneys, we like to use Latin. So defamation per se are statements where harm to reputation is presumed. So in other words, you don't have to prove that your statement harmed somebody. And these are statements that there are a few different explicitly stated categories in the law, but the two most common categories are statements that reflect negatively about someone in their profession, and then statements accusing somebody of a crime. So, good example is, let's say somebody says, that Ward Evans guy, he steals from his clients. A, no. B, that kind of is that hits both of those two most common buckets of defamation per se statements, because it A, damages me and my reputation, right? If people think that I'm going to steal money from them, they're not going to use me as their attorney. And B, it accuses me of a crime, because theft is obviously a crime. So in either of those statement or that statement, for either of those two reasons, a court would see that and they would say, okay, we're going this statement, accused Ward of a crime, harmed him in his professional reputation. So we're going to presume that his reputation has been damaged. The other type of statement is a statement that is defamation per quad, which means that it injures someone's reputation in a way that causes them what Georgia calls special damages, which just means some sort of economic, financial loss. But you have to actually, state what those damages are and then prove them. So a good example of this is if someone says, this person cheats on their spouse. That could certainly harm, I mean, that would harm somebody's reputation. But it's going to be, that's not enough. You have to show, because it's not a defamation because the statement isn't defamatory per se, because it doesn't harm them in their reputation, harm them in their professional reputation, and it doesn't accuse them of a crime. This person will have to show not only that it harmed their reputation, but that they experience some sort of financial loss from that. And as you can imagine, there are ways you could go about showing that, but it wouldn't be the easiest thing in the world necessarily to show how that statement of, so and so cheated on their spouse, how that caused them actual financial harm. Um, so. Uh, that's something to remember. As we think about the strategies, um, or as you think about the strategy of what you're writing, if you write statements that are defamatory per se, it's going to be easier to sue you for defamation for those statements than if you write statements that are not defamatory per se. Now, there are statements that are just not defamatory. So statements again that are true, those aren't defamatory statements. Statements that are opinion, that's not defamatory. Statements and again, a statement that is a statement of opinion is a statement that's not falsifiable. So if a statement is asserting fact and that statement is falsifiable, then it is a statement of fact. And if it's not falsifiable, then that's an opinion. Um, so satire, like The Onion, that's not defamatory. Hyperbole, again, probably like The Onion, also not defamatory. Um, if a statement doesn't have a defamatory meaning, like it's not harmful to someone's reputation, like calling somebody, saying so and so is a vegan, that's not going to count as defamatory. If a statement has minor inaccuracies, the date wrong or something like that, that will be, assuming that the overall meaning is true, that's also not going to be defamatory in all likelihood. And then if the subject of the statement is deceased, that also doesn't constitute defamation. So we have a couple hypotheticals here. I think we'll just go through. No, I'll kind of walk through the first couple, and then we'll move on. So let's say that I orally tell your editor that you falsified an interview with a source. Is that defamation? Well, yeah, yes, that's slander, assuming you didn't falsify the interview, right? Which of course nobody would do. But a statement of truth can't be defamation. So if you did, then that's not defamatory. But if you didn't, yes, that would absolutely be defamatory. So next, let's say that you write a story about a high-profile UGA football player using PEDs based on anonymous sources, and part of the story turns out to be untrue. Is that defamation? Well, this is a little bit trickier because it depends. It says part of the story is untrue. The question is, what part of the story was untrue? If you got a date wrong, probably not a big deal. If you got wrong that the person actually used PEDs, that's that's not going to be substantially true, and that could constitute defamation. Questions would be: you're using an anonymous source. Is that source credible? Did you vet the source? And then is the football player a private person or a limited purpose public figure? These days with players being paid, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, it may be that, the starting quarterback would probably be viewed differently than, a third string walk on. And so the negligence standard may apply to someone who's less, or would, apply to someone who's less well known, but it may be that the actual malice standard may apply to, you know, someone who's nationally known. And then Christina, let's skip through the rest of these, I think, and let's move on to strategy. Yes. So again, truth is your best defense. If what you're writing is true, you can't be held liable for defamation. So, you want to corroborate your information. You don't want to rely on just one person. You want to use language that's factual and precise. One of the things we see a lot is, if you are using information that you obtain from a complaint, that information hasn't been proven true in a court. And so someone, someone suing somebody or even charges brought by the state against a person, if those haven't been actually ruled on by, a judge or a jury, then you have to be sure that you're saying that it was alleged that, or, so and so is alleged to have done something, not that they actually did. Um, so, one thing to think about too as you're writing is, let facts speak for themselves. Like I said, it's easier to sustain a claim for something that's defamation per se rather than something that's defamation per quad. So if you think that someone is acting illegally, um, I would recommend not saying this person broke the law, but instead, laying out the facts of what happened and then let the reader come to the conclusion themselves, oh my gosh, it seems like this person has broken the law. Because then, you aren't saying something that is defamatory per se, but you're still communicating the same idea to the reader. So next, we'll go on and talk about copyright. And what is copyright? It's a form of intellectual property ownership that protects original works of authorship with creative expression that is fixed into a tangible medium. And that's kind of a lot of words to say. It creates, pretty much, or it rather protects pretty much anything that you create originally. So how do you copyright something? The copyright exists automatically, but as soon as you actually, fix something into a tangible medium, so a mere idea can't be copyrighted. To enforce it, you have to just uh, register your copyright with the Copyright Office. And what can be copyrighted? Next, it can be, I mean, anything you can think of, literary works, musical works, news articles can be copyrighted, but the actual underlying facts can't be copyrighted. Anything with that requires a modicum of creativity can be copyrighted. So next, Christina, um, there's a there's a there's a famous case. It's known as the Orange Prince case, where in this instance, Vanity Fair used so a photographer took the picture on the left, and Vanity Fair got with Andy Warhol and who used the picture to who used the picture as a template and added this orange kind of effect to it, and Vanity Fair ran it, and the photographer um, asserted that that it violated her copyright, and it ended up going all the way up to the federal Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that yes, this did violate the photographer's copyright. So if you're so you you know uh you can't merely you obviously can't take something that somebody else created and do nothing to it and then uh, use that. But you also, if you're going to use something that somebody else created, you have to transform it or provide some sort of additional meaning to it. So next, Christina, there's something you can do. There's a doctrine called fair use. Um, in certain instances, news reporting, education purposes, you can use things that are copyrighted w without being held liable for copyright infringement. But as the next slide shows, there are a significant amount of fa factors and honestly ambiguity in how courts address whether something is or is not fair use. Courts will look at four factors: the purpose and character of the use, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and the substantiality of the portion of the work that was used, and then the effect that the potentially infringing use has on the market for that original work. And again, it's very difficult to accurately kind of guess ahead of time how a court will rule on any one particular use. So we would recommend reaching out to us or other attorneys. If you have questions about whether something is or isn't a fair use, please reach out to somebody. And we'll skip these fair use hypotheticals here. Just strategy takeaways. When in doubt, ask for permission. If someone allows you to use if somebody allows you to use their work, then you can use it and it's not going to be infringement. Just because you find something on the internet does not mean that it's in the public domain. If you want to use something, you still need to get permission to use it. It's better to link to or embed copyrighted content rather than just taking a screenshot of it and publishing it, because that way you're sending people to if you link something on your website, you're sending people to someone else's website, the original creator's website. And again, please, even if you think it is fair use, please reach out to us. Um, Next, we have just a couple of potential claims to think about as you are, or things to think about as you're getting news. So Georgia is a single party consent state for audio recording. So if you're talking to somebody, you can record a telephone call with them, or a conversation, and you don't have to notify them. But it's a two-party consent state for visual recording. So photographs or videos, you can't make those of people without telling them ahead of time, hey, uh, um, I'm making a video or something like that. Or if you're in public, that's you have a right to take photographs and videos of people that are in public, but you just don't want to be, climbing up on a tree taking a picture of somebody in their own like private home or something like that. Next, like I said, you have a right to record in public. This includes, at protests, this includes police officers. Obviously, Christina uh, gave a significant amount of fantastic information about how to, stay safe if you are if you're at a protest. But as you're doing that, like you said, people don't like to be recorded a lot of times. So if you record the police, you have a legal right to do it, but just, know it could kind of be be not well taken all the time. But as long as you are following police directives, you have a right to record them. Um, and then finally, other potential torts, publication of private facts. So you want to be sure that what you're publishing, that there is a legitimate public interest in that, and that you aren't just airing somebody's dirty laundry. And then intrusion upon seclusion. Like I said, when you are gathering information about somebody, don't want to do so in a way that intrudes on their private spaces. So, like one example would be if you're trying to get an interview, don't corner somebody in a bathroom, right? There are ways, and you certainly don't want to violate any laws as you go about obtaining information on people. So there are, ways to get information uh, that are completely normal and fine and protected. And then there are other ways that could get you into somewhat hot water. So that is that is it. Does anybody have any? I don't know if we have. I know we're at the tail end of the presentation here. So if anybody has any questions, and it doesn't look like there's anything in the chat. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. I know, just very briefly, I know there is another presentation that GFAF is doing, that Christina will do on protesters' rights. That's on October 14th, Thursday, October 14th at noon. And then finally, there is the Weltner banquet, that is coming up on October 28th. And I see here in the chat that a recording of this